I've been thinking lately about the joy in becoming familiar with spaces in video games, their shape, how they connect with one another and create the world, and the function and significance of the spaces within the fiction. For me, the most interesting game worlds continually recontextualize themselves even as I familiarize myself with them on both the local and global scales. On a local scale, this can be clever shortcuts within the area that compress the space, or gimmicks and geometry that craft a unique set of rules for the area. On a global scale, this comes in the form of unexpected connections between areas, surprising freedom between areas, and/or an unforeseen scope of the world. Across all of this, the world comes alive as these spaces are given meaning within their own ecology and within the world as their relative positions between each other knits together a living, or once living, world with a history and future that you, through your character, are now a part of. The reason I've been musing about the joy of experiencing game worlds is the game CODEX LOST. CODEX LOST is an upcoming action RPG created by a single developer who reached out to me, offering me a key for their love letter to Kingsfield and Elden Ring. I'm about 16 hours in, and I wanted to share why CODEX LOST has me unexpectedly hooked. Let's get into it. In CODEX LOST, you play as an avian-looking curator. The curators are bound to the Great Library even beyond death, and your character is the first to appear in 100 years. As a curator, you're tasked with returning 5 powerful magical tomes called the grimoires to the Great Library. This is explained in a very charming opening cinematic featuring a slideshow of images accompanied by bombastic music and an earnest narration. In this opening cinematic, you learn about the 5 big bads who stole the grimoires for their own selfish purposes. I love a baddie roll call. So it's now up to you, the last curator of the Great Library, to retrieve the grimoires so that they can be, and I quote, leased in moderation once again. I absolutely love the word choices here, and how the premise boils down to you being a library cop in search of some massively overdue books. After this opening, you're put into a short tutorial and then you're let loose into the world. The world is broken up into open world zones and dungeons, similar to Elden Ring. Unlike Elden Ring, however, where the dungeons are generally dead ends contained within the open world zones, the dungeons in CODEX LOST are often the connective tissue between areas, and in many cases multiple areas. This web of open world zones and dungeons means you're constantly pushing forward without hitting a dead end, and this still rings true 16 hours into the game. It creates the feeling I had with Dark Souls 1 down in Blighttown or Hollow Knight in Kingdom's Edge, where you're both excited and terrified to be so far away from home out in the wilderness without an easy way back. CODEX LOST does have fast travel through portals as well as through these memory fonts, where you can have one font active to travel to at a time, but they're scarce enough where there are large stretches in between them and feel like a huge windfall when you do discover them. This kind of exploration does come with some frustration, as I've had instances where particularly long stretches of exploration end in death, which also drops your accumulated experience like in Dark Souls. This left me to either retrace my steps across the world or abandon my accumulated experience at my corpse and go in a different direction. But I think this potential frustration is worth the initially bewildering and expansive world design as the world begins to weave together. As you unlock shortcuts and gain new Metroidvania-style traversal abilities, the world starts to come into focus. The web-like world design means that your expeditions across the world inevitably begin to form intersections, and you begin to recognize the ways in which your treks could become much shorter. It feels kind of like playing Pac-Man and finally discovering that going out on the left side makes you reappear on the right side. While I've mentioned Dark Souls and Elden Ring, the obtuse world, limited fast travel, and trust in the player to figure things out reminds me most strongly of Kingsfield, the ancient city. And it's not just these elements, but also the combat and how it ties into the exploration that reminds me of the ancient city. As mentioned before, the combat of CODEX LOST focuses on spells. You have a spell book with a certain number of spell slots that can be increased by putting levels into your wisdom stat, and normally you can only equip spells in the Great Library. Because you may go long stretches without being able to change your spells, you pretty quickly learn that you'll need to take a variety of spells for flexibility. You have to consider high damage single target spells for tough enemies, AoEs for crowd control, ranged spells for enemies that you want to take out from a distance, melee basic spells that cost no mana for scrub enemies you can deal with up close, status effects you want to use, etc. On top of all that, elemental resistances and weaknesses are pretty pronounced with enemies, so you also want to try and get the right variety of elements in your spellbook. All of this reminds me of Kingsfield, the Ancient City, in which you're not making a build as much as you have a set of tools at your disposal, and it's up to you to figure out how to best tackle the world with these tools. I've personally taken a strong liking to poison spells, not just because the damage over time of poison is pretty effective against most enemies, but because hitting an enemy with a couple of poison spells is pretty mana efficient. Most spells cost mana to use, and mana slowly regenerates over time. It sucks to run out of mana, but it's bound to happen when you're exploring out in the world for a while, especially if you don't manage your mana expenditure efficiently, which I'm honestly a little torn on. On the one hand, I think mana as a survival resource adds some nice tension to the exploration, and another element to consider as you're choosing spells. But I've also occasionally resorted to the degenerate tactic of parking my character in the corner of a dungeon and grabbing a snack to allow my meter to go back up, which feels bad in gaming. CODEX LOST uses stamina to govern how rapidly you can cast spells and how many hits your magical shield can tank, which I think is an effective way to enforce the pace of combat. So it does make sense that mana is more of a slow burn survival resource and helps enforce not simply spamming your strongest spells, but it still ends up feeling a bit arbitrary when it can be circumvented by simply waiting around. It may just be a matter of tweaking the rate of mana recovery, or at least giving the player more ways to manipulate it, which could very well exist in the game as a charm. At 16 hours in, I haven't seen anything like this so far, and my solution has been to dump a bunch of levels into intelligence to raise my mana to a level where it's not as much of an issue. The actual combat experience in CODEX LOST is perfectly fine for me. The combat is on the slower side, and feedback on dealing damage to enemies or taking damage is not always great, but I think the combat serves its role. As mentioned before, you have a magic shield that you can keep up to tank hits at the cost of stamina. The shield also has a Sekiro-style deflect system where you can stun nearby enemies by activating the shield right before being hit, and I've actually enjoyed that quite a bit. As feels fitting for a game where you're playing as a caster retrieving tomes of power, the success or failure of combat has more to do with the preparation of your spellbook and having the right tools and mana on hand to get the job done. As you become more familiar with the fairly robust lineup of monsters and foes, you're able to make better decisions about how to handle the challenges ahead of you. This is also true of the bosses, where the fun is more in figuring out the elements and type of spells to use than executing the actual combat. I won't spoil the solution I came to, but Krevlon, the first big bad, was giving me some trouble. I'd previously used spells on tough guys that had high stun and dealt solid damage, but that wasn't working on him. So after being sent packing back to the Great Library, I perused my options, crafted a couple of new spells, and then cut through him like a hot knife through butter on my next attempt. While executing the fight wasn't necessarily any great shakes in the gameplay, the process of outsmarting the fight was satisfying and felt of a piece with the philosophy of exploration and storytelling in the world. Speaking of storytelling, we need to talk about the story and world of CODEX LOST. Being the lore hunter, I would be remiss if I gave impressions about CODEX LOST and I didn't talk about the story and lore. The short answer is that I've enjoyed them both so far, and that my understanding of the world and story is still in the early stages, as a number of proper nouns and concepts are presenting themselves. Like the Souls games, the objects of the world come with post-its on the bottom that present fractured snippets that I've enjoyed slowly bringing together in the same manner as exploring the physical spaces of the game. The 5 big bads who stole the grimoires have an intermingled and involved history that is slowly unfolding, and I've been pleasantly surprised how well considered the world is. There's clearly been a lot of effort into crafting the complicated fiction of this world, and there's a whole bunch of evocative characters and concepts on display. Listen, I'm a simple man. I hear about a guy called Sky King who ruled over the conclaves of the sky, and I'm a pig in mud. The Curators are mysterious in their own right. There's something going on surrounding the first Curators and Ascension, I look forward to uncovering what I can only assume are some dark mysteries about the nature of our protagonist's order, who are somehow immortal and yet all of them are now gone. The materials you collect to craft spells, some of which have names I simply cannot remember immediately after reading them, have some evocative and fun musings about the nature of magic in other realms. The concept of magic coming from a realm that does not exist yet, as an explanation of why it can defy the laws of nature, is a particularly fun bit of flavor. The Great Library is a mystical and somewhat menacing place, and like many of the NPCs, I expect the friendly relationship we currently have to eventually sour. Speaking of the characters, they are a highlight of my time with Codex Lost so far. I can see some folks not having the patience for their more involved monologues, but in my time with the game I've only met a handful of these charmingly quirky weirdos, and each interaction has been a small event that I've enjoyed. There are also some familiar voices from the Souls streaming community on display, which is fun. As I said at the start, Codex Lost has been a pleasant reminder how much fun I derive from exploring a world. There is a verisimilitude in Codex Lost in how the story and world are both explored through expeditions into the unknown, in which you are left to recognize the intersections and through familiarity develop an understanding. This hands-off style of storytelling and exploration isn't exclusive to Codex Lost by any means, but I think it's a really good example of it. It's a humble product that can be a little janky or unpolished, and also a world that I'm finding incredibly satisfying to explore. And that's ultimately what I think has me hooked on Codex Lost right now and why I'm making this video only 16 hours in. It's fun to be in a world that isn't interested in revealing itself to you, that actively obfuscates understanding it. There's a satisfaction in this tension and ultimately overcoming and becoming familiar with it, from the geometry of spaces, to the enemy encounters, to the layout of the world, and the involved history imbued into all of it. By the end of the game, I suspect the world will reveal itself to be smaller than how it feels 16 hours in, and that's fine. I created this video because from where I'm standing now, the world feels bewilderingly expansive and mysterious, and even if this feeling is fleeting in the long run, it's an experience worth having. I know it's a cliche, but it really is about the journey and not the destination, and my journey in Codex Lost has been wonderful so far. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment. I don't know what my plans are for more Codex Lost content, but if you want more, you can show your support here in this video. And let me know what other games you'd be interested in seeing me cover on the channel. Please subscribe to the Lore Hunter and turn notifications on if you'd like to see more content from the channel. Thanks for watching.